Assalamu alaikum students, welcome to lecture 3 at Virtual University, the introduction of cultural anthropology. Today is an important lecture. In this lecture we will talk about the idea of the various important theories that inform cultural anthropology. Now, cultural anthropology, as we have introduced over the past 2 lectures, is a very diverse and a simultaneously basic yet complicated subject, since it tries to look at the human condition and try to understand human behavior. Now, in order to do this, cultural anthropology has some fundamental basic theories which guide cultural anthropology, and today we are going to be looking at some of these major theories. So, like I said, we're going to move on today by trying to look at these underpinning theories which inform the discipline of cultural anthropology. Now, in order to do this, I will first focus your attention on the idea of a theory. And I will do so by asking a basic question: what is a theory? A theory suggests a relationship between existing phenomena. Now, in saying this, in making this claim that a theory tries to establish a relationship between existing phenomena, what one is trying to say is that there is a huge diversity of circumstances, of conditions that are evidently found on Earth. I mean, human existence has various forms. There are various forms of problems, there are various forms of ingenuity, of diversity, of versatility to be found within the human being. Now, what a theory tries to do is it tries to make an informed opinion regarding this phenomenon. अब जो इंसान जो कल्चरल थ्योरी में मिसाल के तौर पे अब जो इंसानों के रहने के अंदाज हैं, बोलने के अंदाज हैं, बातें करने के अंदाज हैं, उनको थ्योरी के ज़रिए एक्सप्लेन किया जाता है. सो थ्योरी जो है वो अटेम्प्ट है कि एग्जिस्टिंग फिनोमेनन को एक्सप्लेन करे. In order to do this, what theories do is they allow us to reduce the complexity of reality into an abstract set of principles which serve as models to compare and contrast different types of reality. Now, this doesn't have to only apply to the idea of cultural anthropology. This definition of a theory holds true for any discipline. किसी भी डिसिप्लिन में आप जो complexity है of circumstances, that can be explained with reference to basically a theory which tries to look at the gist. जो जुज़ होता है, मसले का जो जुज़ होता है, उसके ऊपर फोकस करती है theory. So a theory will try to explain the fundamental aspects of a problem and try to deal with them. It will try to compare and contrast different types of realities. जब एक theory है वो fundamentally pick up कर देती है या highlight कर लेती है उन particular issues को जो कि fundamental points होते हैं एक problem के बारे में, let's say, तो वो फिर theory ये कर सकती है कि वो क्योंकि एक abstract idea है. A theory is, now if I'm looking at the issue of poverty, I can develop a theory about poverty कि poverty जो है वो इस वजह से poverty exist करती है. Now I can, by virtue of a theory, मुझे ये फ़ायदा होएगा कि मैं उस theory को apply कर सकूँगा मुख्तलिफ circumstances में. I don't have to necessarily confine myself to the definition of poverty कि जिसकी जेब में 10 रुपए से कम है वो गरीब है. जो दिन में 10 रुपए से सकता हूं कि जिसके पास परचेसिंग पावर नहीं है वो गरीब है. तो वो फिर चाहे अगर वो जापान में रहता है और उसकी जेब में अगर 2 येन हैं तो वो भी गरीब हो सकता है, क्योंकि मैं इक्वेट नहीं कर रहा पॉवर्टी को विद द अमाउंट ऑफ रुपीज इन द पॉकेट. आई एम टॉकिंग अबाउट परचेसिंग पावर, एंड परचेसिंग पावर जो है वो पैसे से आ रही है. एंड इफ आई एम ट्राइंग टू डिफाइन पॉवर्टी बाय वर्च्यू ऑफ परचेसिंग पावर, आई हैव डेवलप्ड अ थियरी. I have developed a theory that जिसके पास purchasing power नहीं है, that person is considered poor. And by virtue of this theory, I can look at poverty, the phenomena of poverty in Pakistan. I can look at the phenomena of poverty in Japan. So a theory gives you the advantage of taking a problem, of looking at its fundamental issues, of applying your theory to extract those vital issues and compare those issues with another set of issues, with another reality. And that is the advantage of developing a theory. Theories are generally based on hypotheses. And based on hypotheses, they provide a proposition that needs to be tested through empirical investigation. अब इसका कहने का मकसद ये है, this is again a generalized statement regarding theories which can be applied to any subject, to the study, to the scientific investigation of any academic principle, be it cultural anthropology, be it sociology, be it economics, be it the natural sciences, like chemistry or biology. Basically, a theory, in order to develop a theory, you need a hypothesis. हाइपोथेसिस क्या है? हाइपोथेसिस है कि वो एक प्रीसपोजिशन लेता है. वो कहता है कि जी हाइपोथेसिस में ये क्लेम किया जाता है कि अगर तो मेरी थ्योरी सही हुई तो अगर सर्कमस्टांसेस को मैंने देखा और एविडेंस को देखा तो अगर वो एविडेंस जो है अगर वो फिट इन कर जाएगी मेरे हाइपोथेसिस के साथ तो दैट मीन्स कि माय हाइपोथेसिस इज करेक्ट. That means that my theory has been reinforced. So, अब इसको करने के लिए, इस proposition को prove करने के लिए, अपने hypothesis की proposition को prove करने के लिए आपको सहारा चाहिए ground reality का, आपको सहारा चाहिए evidence का. अब मैं theory एक बना लूं अपनी कि जी सारे पाकिस्तानी बड़े अच्छे हैं. That is a theory. My hypothesis would be that all Pakistanis are great people. Now, in order to prove my theory, I need some evidence. कोई मुझे मिसाल तो मेरे पास होनी चाहिए ना to back my claim कि जी सारे पाकिस्तानी बड़े अच्छे हैं. So, in order to prove any theory, you basically need to show evidence. You need to show from ground realities, you need to provide evidence to back your claim, to back your hypothesis, to back your proposition. That is a fundamental requirement of a theory. Now, having laid down these basic principles of what a theory is, I will move on and look at a particular theory that is very important in the idea of anthropology, in the idea of studying cultural anthropology. And this theory is called cultural evolution. Now, some of you might be familiar with the idea of evolution, and the idea of evolution was developed by Darwin. And Darwin proposed that every living species over time has evolved. We were not born, we were not created the way we are, but rather over time we have developed as human beings. And this is a very important scientific theory. And there are various aspects of this theory. I mean, there is biological, I mean, you can look at the idea of evolution at a biological level. You can look at the idea of evolution at a physical level. You can apply the idea of evolution to politics, to the development of political systems, to the development of political theories, to the development of culture, to the development of cultural sophistication. So there have been academics within the branch of cultural anthropology who latched on to the idea of evolution and developed the notion of cultural evolution. And this is a very important theory in cultural anthropology, and I will now highlight some of its main features for you. All cultures undergo the same development stages in the same order: savagery, barbarism, and civilization. Now, before I explain this particular point, I will quickly add that it is important to keep in mind that these theories themselves evolve. I mean, today we might be looking at this theory and consider it to be a bit absurd, but we have to keep in mind that this theory was, the theory of cultural evolution, was developed more than 100 years ago. It was developed at a time where cultural differences were justified on the basis of supernatural causes. I mean, it was thought that black people have something in their genes that makes them, better, more receptive to music. It was thought that gypsies have something in their blood that, makes them, khana badosh jo hota hai, that makes them want to travel all the time and not settle down. It was thought that there are particular issues that people have bad blood because of which they commit crime. So there were all these sort of unexplainable reasons attributed to human behavior. And cultural evolution, although some of its ideas may seem basic now, broke away from that. It tried to provide some kind of a scientific basis to look at culture, to the idea of cultural difference. And its first stage was considered to be, at a very basic level, to be that of savagery. And savagery was further classified as lower, middle, and upper savagery. Now, these cultural evolutionists thought that all societies, all cultures, all people have gone through these basic stages. And the first stage was that of lower savagery. That was the first stage of their evolution. In this stage of lower savagery, people were basically hunters. They were basically gatherers. I mean, they didn't know how to hunt. All they could do was pick up fruits or pick up nuts and berries and eat them. They didn't even have the capacity to hunt. Subsequently, at a middle stage of savagery, people, as they evolved over time, were able to make fire. That was the better end of savagery. And at the higher stage of savagery, people were actually able to hunt. So this is one classification that supposedly all people went through according to the cultural evolutionists. Then came this other stage of barbarism. In barbarism, the first benchmark, there were again 3 sub-branches in barbarism. Most basic level of barbarism was the use of pottery. When people were able to use clay and put it into the shape of vessels and all, that was the first stage of barbarism. The second stage of barbarism, according to these people, was the development of irrigation, when people actually started farming. And at the third stage, they started using metals. That was the upper end of barbarism. So from this upper end of barbarism, came the notion of civilization, and of civilizations evolving and going from the stage of basic civilization to the stage of very advanced civilization. But what's important to remember here is that cultural anthropologists that followed this train of thought basically felt that all cultures go through the same type of evolution, through the same process of evolution. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that evolution is unidirectional according to this theory and leads to higher levels of culture. So these theorists felt that not only do all people undergo the same processes of savagery, barbarism, and then civilization, but this is a kind of a development that is unidirectional. I mean, it is that all cultures have to go through these stages to reach the idea of civilization. And they have to go through certain processes within civilization in order to qualify for other processes. So they felt that basically certain civilizations in the West were at the upper end of civilization. Now, cultural evolution has a bit of a deductive approach. Cultural evolution one has to admit that cultural evolution was an interesting idea that took on the idea of science developed by Darwin, but at the same time there were certain problems with the idea of cultural evolution that I will just mention. But before doing so, the important thing to remember is that cultural evolution used a deductive approach. Now, what is a deductive approach? A deductive approach takes circumstances and it doesn't use the circumstances to make a theory. It takes a theory and explains those various circumstances. So it has a general principle, and based on that general principle, it will look at various circumstances and try to seek justifications for those circumstances based on a general theory. It's like me saying poverty means having less than 100 rupees, and then I go out, on the streets of Lahore and try to find all those people who have less than 100 rupees. So that is taking a general principle and using a deductive approach. Instead of going around and seeing how much money people have and then looking at people who cannot even eat and then seeing what amount of money they have and then saying the people who have that amount of money, that little amount of money must be poor. I turn it around the other way. So this is what deduction means. And cultural evolution uses a deductive approach to apply a general theory to specific cases. This is the kind of approach that cultural evolution used. Evolutionists were often ethnocentric, as they put their own societies on top of the evolutionary ladder. Like I said before, evolutionists, there was a great tendency for evolutionists to think that since they themselves, these cultural evolutionists, belong to Europe and to America, they had already reached the level of industrialization, and they felt that their societies were at the top end of civilization. And all these other poor developing countries had to go through the same processes in order to qualify for being civilized, for being highly civilized. And this was an ethnocentric approach, which, if you recall, means assuming that your own culture is superior to everyone else's culture. Now, the important thing to remember about cultural evolution, I mean, although some of these other ideas might seem a bit strange, the thing to remember about cultural evolution is that human behavior was explained by rational instead of supernatural causes. This, again, is trying to show you that the advantage of having a theory is that theories are informed by circumstance, and theories can explain a lot of circumstances and evolve themselves. Theories themselves evolve. And at the time, if you look at the development of this particular theory, you will realize that cultural evolution, given the kind of thinking that was pervasive and going around in those days, it was actually a positive step, because it tried to basically provide a rational explanation for cultural difference. Instead of saying that, some people are cursed to be walking around without clothes and, with spears in their hands, it tried to provide some kind of a rationale. I mean, that rationale might not stand to reason, from our perspective. from the perspective of a 21st century student or academic, but at the time these kinds of theories, and this theory was considered to be an evolution in itself. Now I will turn to another theory, and another theory within cultural anthropology is that of diffusion. Now diffusion claimed that all societies change as a result of cultural borrowing from one another. Diffusion basically considered humans to be fairly ininventive. I mean, it thought that it didn't really emphasize the idea of invention. It thought that one thing that is invented in a particular society tends to keep going around and diffuses. I mean, let's say the Chinese developed the notion of a wheel, and that notion traveled everywhere around the world. So in this theory, the idea of one idea traveling from one culture to another was realized. And this was an important realization, the realization that ideas can actually travel from one place to another. And because of this, diffusion is considered important in these times, and it's important to look at the theory of diffusion. Although some of the things proposed by diffusion were a bit absurd. Before mentioning that some of the absurdity tied to diffusion, I will have to point out another important thing, and that's the idea that, like evolutionism, diffusionism was deductive as well, and it was a bit too theoretical. It did not look at circumstances. जो ज़मीन पे हालात थे उनको कम देखता था. Diffusionism भी, वो भी उस diffusionist की भी tendency थी to be like the armchair theorist, कि वहाँ कुर्सी पर बैठ के वो feel करते थे कि हमें जी सब कुछ समझ आ गया. उनमें भी एक ये tendency थी. Now diffusionism highlighted the need to consider interaction between cultures, but overemphasize the essentially valid idea of diffusion. ये जो theory थी, उसने एक तो अच्छा ये काम किया कि उसने ये idea theoretically across करा दिया, establish करा दिया कि जी एक culture से दूसरे culture में ideas जो हैं वो transfer होते हैं. Which was, at the time this was a novel idea, to realize that cultures interact and influence each other. And to establish that, in terms of a theoretical principle, the realization and the use of this principle by cultural anthropologists to study people was a serious accomplishment. But the diffusionists got a bit carried away with this idea. And this brings me to the earlier point that, diffusionism now seems a bit strange. I mean, there were some prominent thinkers within diffusionism who thought that essentially all the innovation is, with a small amount of tinkering, has originated from Egyptian civilization. So the Egyptians were the most inventive, the most civilized form of human culture, and from that time there have basically there's been this diffusion of Egyptian civilization to other parts of the world, and that's how civilization spread, which seems a bit hard to believe in present circumstances. Now, historicism is another theory that was developed basically in the United States. And theory of historicism states that any culture is partially composed of traits diffused from other cultures. So it admits, that there was some substance to the idea of diffusionism, but this does not explain the existing complexity of different cultures. So, from the viewpoint of historicism, cultural diffusion is not enough. Cultural diffusion does not explain the complexity of different cultures. Now, the good thing about historicism was that it was an inductive approach. It focused on the collection of ethnographic facts, and it insisted that before developing any kind of cultural theory, it was important to look at the ground realities. Now, this was an interesting and a very important step forward in terms of cultural theory. It was a sort of a leap forward, as it were, and it firmly planted the idea of cultural anthropology as a creditable science. It used similar principles to other scientists by asserting the fact that essentially you cannot just make a theory out of thin air. Just because you think something sounds good doesn't necessarily mean that that's true. So, in order for cultural anthropologists to be able to prove their hypothesis, they need to find empirical evidence. They need to have evidence of ground realities which proves that their theory holds some substance. This is an inductive approach. Before, we had spoken about the deductive approach, and the deductive approach does exactly the opposite. I mean, it takes a theory, a good sounding theory, which might be very sophisticated, but it takes that theory and it tries to apply that to ground realities. It says, okay, poverty must mean having less than 100 rupees. And then it goes out trying to find poor people with less than 100 rupees. Or it says that intelligence must mean that you can recite Bange Dara, for example. And it goes around trying to find people who can recite Bange Dara or, couplets from Ghalib. And it doesn't look at existing circumstances and form the idea of intelligence based on existing circumstances. That is what an inductive approach is going to do. An inductive approach will look at circumstances, it will look at different people, it will look at how within those circumstances certain people tend to show signs of intelligence, and then say, based on those signs, determine the idea of intelligence. It could be that, it's 100 poor people and 2 or 3 of them seem to be doing well despite their poverty. So it will look at the circumstances of those 2 or 3 people and then say, in these circumstances, this is ingenuity, this is effort. Despite their circumstances, they are at least trying. So this is the definition of trying. This is the definition of ingenuity. So this is an inductive approach. And historicism did use an inductive approach. Now, historicism relied on direct field work. It emphasized direct field work, which was considered essential, which has provided the approach a solid methodological base, emphasizing the need for empirical evidence. Now, this is just another way of trying to get across the point that the historicism theoretical approach relied on existing circumstances. It told its disciples, as it were, I mean, they were scholars who identified themselves with this particular branch of cultural anthropology. It basically meant that these particular scholars would go out into the field and try to immerse themselves in a particular culture, to sort of go and live in a culture, to try and find out in a culture what those people thought, how those people behaved, how those people acted, what were their values, what were the reasons behind those behaviors, those values, those ideas. And based on this ground reality, they could only then try to develop a theory. Now, this was the exact opposite of what the diffusionists or what the evolutionists did. And this was the inductive approach, focusing on ground reality, focusing on trying to get evidence. So, essentially, this particular approach within the discipline this approach of historicism provided a very solid methodological basis to the theory of cultural anthropology. And providing this methodological basis, it was also a bit more humble than evolutionists, at least. I mean, it realized that each culture does not go through the exact same processes of cultural development. And this was an important realization. Historicism realized that each culture is to some degree unique. It admitted to this fact, at least, which was theoretical advancement to the idea of evolutionism. And historicism also emphasized that ethnographers should try to get the views of those being studied, not only rely on their own views. So essentially, it focused on the idea of talking to the native, of talking to people who were being studied, of getting their views, of looking at their concerns, their issues, talking to them, not only focusing on, the person, the ethnographer who goes there with his briefcase trying to, trying to sort of put words in the mouths of people that they go and try to study. I mean, essentially, ethnographers were, under this theory, were guided to be very careful and very precise in drawing the line between what the natives thought and said and what these people themselves thought. And the focus was meant to be on looking at the ground realities, on looking at what the native thought, on looking at what the native of a particular environment, of a particular locality thought. Historicism also emphasized the need for training female anthropologists to gain access to information about female behavior in traditional societies. I mean, this was an interesting development that took place. I mean, historicism realized that by virtue of its nature of study, it would try to use female anthropologists. The reason for trying to use female anthropologists was that since there was an emphasis on trying to discover ground realities, and a lot of these ground realities took place in societies that were conservative, traditional, that did not look favorably to the idea of strange men, be they researchers or anthropologists, coming and observing the women of those communities, that would prevent cultural anthropology to find out the circumstances of these women. And the only way for them to find out the circumstances and the problems and the way these women in different types of societies were living was to train female anthropologists. And therefore, historicism encouraged a lot of females, and very famous female anthropologists were trained by this emphasis. Due to this emphasis, they were able to obtain training and contributed immensely to the field of cultural anthropology. And one of them was named Margaret Mead, whose name you will come across in your own readings on cultural anthropology. Now, the problem with historicism was its anti-theoretical stance. It basically was criticized for retarding growth of the anthropological discipline. Now, historicism, in its emphasis to focus on ground reality, to focus on what the native local people thought and felt about their own circumstances, it tended to place a bar on theory. It emphasized that anthropologists working under this discipline should go out into the field and look at the problems, talk to the people, and gather evidence. And gather a lot of evidence before any theories could be made. And to a certain degree, this prevented the development of anthropological theories. And there were critics who blamed historicism for this sort of retardation of anthropological theory. Now I will move on to the idea of psychological anthropology. And psychological anthropology, working under this discipline, focus on the need to explore the relationships between psychological and cultural variables. So anthropologists in this regard, I mean, they try to look at the connection between culture and the psyche, between the human mind, between how particular people think and how those thought processes are influenced by their surrounding cultures. And this is also a very interesting and important field of research. And I mean, there are various significant influences that our cultures have on us. I mean, and in terms of, being Pakistanis and located in a geostrategic environment with a particular history and a particular education system and a particular religion, all these things have a tremendous influence on who we are. Now, for psychological anthropology, the role of personality is very important. And personality, according to these anthropologists, is largely the result of learning culture. So personality, to a great degree, is considered to be influenced by culture. I mean, this is individual personality. Now, me as a Pakistani, by virtue of, all these circumstances, imply that my personality will be formed by all these processes, by the historical processes of being a Muslim who came to the Indian subcontinent, all those hundreds of years ago. I mean, that is a sociological, political phenomena. That's a part of my culture which influences me. I mean, there is the fact that, the colonial empire of the British was here and it established schools, and I went to an English medium school. That formed a part of my personality. So these are influences, cultural influences, that inform the way that our personalities are formed. And this has great value for psychological anthropologists. Psychological anthropology considers universal temperaments to be associated with males and females that do not exist in practice. So psychological anthropologists, one important discovery of psychological anthropologists was that, these sort of supposedly universal attributes of what a male is supposed to be and what a female is supposed to be. If you look at various cultures around the world, you see significant blurring. You see a lot of gray area between personality types, like in terms of, I mean, to use a stereotypical blanket example, I mean, there's this common notion that females are more sensitive, or females are more caring, or females can communicate better, whereas men are more aggressive, or men assume a greater sense of responsibility. These are assumptions, made on the basis of gender. And this is an issue that will be explored in much greater detail in later lectures, the idea of gender. But from an anthropological perspective, but essentially for now, I mean, this theory tried to show that these supposedly universal descriptions do not necessarily hold true when you look at cultures around the globe. You will see in various cultures men acting in ways which are supposedly feminine qualities. You will have women assume a lot of responsibility. I mean, with the phenomenon of globalization, unemployment, decreasing incomes, even women in our own country have assumed a lot of the responsibility of running a household, which is traditionally supposed to be this manly attribute. So circumstances and personality types are not necessarily gender determined. This was an important discovery. Now, another theory that I'll turn your attention to is that of functionalism. Functionalism, like historicism, focused on understanding culture from the perspective of the native. So functionalists also said that it's very important to look at what the native, what the local, what the person who we go and try to study thinks, how that person is affected by their environment, what they think about their circumstances. I mean, we can go and for example, we can, out of our car window, we can look at this, young child who's asking for money and form all these opinions that, he must be trained, and, he's probably not wearing slippers because, he wants to impress people and get more money out of them, by walking around barefoot on a hot road in the middle of summer. But what is that person thinking? So functionalism also at that time was a theory, and this is again at the turn of the 20th century, was trying to understand culture from the perspective of the native, from those who were, from the perspective, from the viewpoint of those being studied. Functionalism was very much focused on the idea of empirical fieldwork. It considered empirical fieldwork to be absolutely essential. And again, like historicism, it focused in the idea of empirical fieldwork, that it is necessary, absolutely necessary, in order to form a theory, to go and do the legwork, to go and see what the circumstances are that we are talking about. How can a cultural anthropologist formulate a theory without knowing how people act and behave and what they do? I mean, there needs to be some evidence for formulating a theory. So groundwork, empirical evidence was considered to be essential. Functionalism also emphasized that anthropologists should seek to understand how different parts of contemporary cultures work for the well-being of the individual and the society, instead of focusing on how these parts evolved. So functionalism took a functionalist approach towards anthropology. It focused on the function of a particular behavior. Instead of seeing how that behavior evolved over time, it said, let's look at the here and the now. Let's look at why this behavior is the way it is. What purpose does this behavior? Functionalism also considered society to be like a biological organism with all of its parts to be interconnected. So it considered culture, it considered society to be interrelated. Like the parts of a body, it thought culture, in particular cultural traits, to be related to each other. Like the concept of zakat in Islam is related to the idea of social equality, to the idea of, giving and sharing and generosity. And it's a distributive system, if you will, in terms of economics. It's like a very effective taxation system. So, and it fits into this idea of this equal distribution of wealth, at least more equitable than it is in many parts of the world, including our own. I mean, if people were to give zakat properly, I mean, there would be a more equitable distribution of wealth. So zakat is one part of the Islamic culture, and it has many implications, and it's part of a particular ideology. And similarly, cultural traits are part of this entire monolithic entity, if you will. And in that regard, these ideas are all interconnected. Now, functionalism, emphasizing the high level of integration, felt that societies tend to be in a state of equilibrium. A change in one part of the system brings a change in another part of the system as well. So, by focusing on the idea of the integration between various cultural traits, functionalism felt that if you remove one trait, it's going to affect the rest of culture as well. It's like, if someone attempts to take out a lung from my body, it's going to upset my entire biological system. So one particular cultural trait is tied into all these other cultural traits, and you cannot change one cultural trait without affecting the entire culture. It considered these institutional structures of any society to perform indispensable functions, without which the society cannot continue. So functionalism said that, like those parts of the body, like those cultural traits, they are institutions within a particular society that perform vital functions. And without those institutions, you would not be able to make that culture function. Like, for example, the concept of zakat, without the idea of zakat, you could not have the idea of equality in Islam. Zakat is a fundamental and very important and crucial component of the Islamic ideology and culture. Now, another very important theory, and this is a theory that's been built upon the older theory of evolution, is this theory of neo-evolution. And neo-evolution feels that cultures evolve in direct proportion to their capacity to harness energy. So, neo-evolutionists, and there is a perceptible, you can feel the influence of neo-evolutionism in cultural anthropology even today. I mean, these anthropologists felt that basically evolution does exist, and the basis of evolution is the capacity of a culture to harness energy. I mean, they even proposed a simple equation which says that energy into technology equals culture. So the greater the technology, the greater the energy, the more sophisticated a culture. Neo-evolutionists maintained that culture is shaped by environmental and technological conditions. They said that environment and technological conditions are very important in culture. I mean, these are the two most important attributes from the neo-evolutionary viewpoint. I mean, the amount of technology and the environmental conditions, surrounding environmental conditions of a culture. I'll just read a quote which describes the idea of neo-evolutionism very well, and it's by Leslie White, who was a neo-evolutionist, born in 1900 and died in 1975. And Leslie White says that culture evolves as the amount of energy harnessed per capita per year increases, or as the efficiency of the means of putting energy to work increases. Again, this very simply emphasizes the idea of energy and how energy is important for culture. Now, neo-evolutionism feels that people facing similar environmental challenges develop similar technological solutions and parallel social and political institutions. By focusing on the environment, by saying that people facing the same environmental problems will essentially react in the same way. They will develop the same technological responses, develop the same economic and political structures. They give the example in the Middle East of Egypt. They give the example in South America of Peru, of relatively dry areas with river systems. And they developed irrigational systems for agricultural purposes, and developed all these economic and cultural and political systems by virtue of this environmental need. So, neo-evolutionism says that basically, again to recap, in addition to the response of environmental factors, cultures evolve when people are able to increase the amount of energy under their control. Neo-evolutionism, in its emphasis on technology, the environment, and the evolution of cultures based on their capacity to harness energy, de-emphasizes the importance of ideas, of beliefs and values, which is, I suppose, critical. This evokes a certain amount of criticism that neo-evolutionism looks at energy. It looks at the idea of energy and how people adapt to the environment on this basis, but it de-emphasizes these notions. Well, this brings me to the conclusion of this lecture. It was a relatively packed lecture, I suppose, since it was trying to look at theories, the important theories of cultural anthropology. I will continue with this type of a lecture in the next lecture as well, because there are 3 or 4 important theories that still need to be spoken about. And thereafter, having now introduced the idea of cultural anthropology and the theories in cultural anthropology, we will use these frameworks to look at real life circumstances, and that's going to be the remainder of the course. But for now, I am going to wrap up the lecture, and I look forward to seeing you next time.